You dip a small spoon into a bag of white crystals, tip it into a cup, and stop thinking about it before you've even finished stirring. It dissolves before you've noticed. Nothing about that gesture feels like history. It feels like nothing at all. But your tongue is running a program that has nothing to do with your morning. The receptors lighting up right now are older than your species, older than primates as we'd recognize them. And the real answer to when humans started eating sugar is stranger than it sounds, because the craving arrived tens of millions of years before the sugar did. Picture a forest that no longer exists in northern Egypt, more than 30 million years ago, thick and wet where there's desert today. Somewhere in that canopy, a small primate, nothing you'd call a monkey or an ape in the modern sense, is choosing what to eat. It has options: hard nuts and seeds, protected by shells that take real effort to crack, or soft, ripe fruit that hands over its calories for free. In a world with no stored food and no guarantee of a meal tomorrow, that's not a small decision. It's a choice between two entirely different survival strategies, and whichever way it leaned would leave a mark not in memory, but in the hardest tissue in its body. Teeth chip when they meet resistance. They decay when they're bathed in sugar long enough for bacteria to feed on it. A skeleton can't tell you what an animal wanted. It can tell you with real precision what it actually chewed, year after year, for the whole of its life. That's the puzzle a team of researchers set out to solve using fossils from a place in Egypt called the Fayum Depression, one of the richest fossil beds anywhere for understanding how monkeys and apes got their start. Dental anthropologist Ian Towley, working with colleagues Matthew Borths and Carolina Locke, examined 402 fossilized teeth belonging to 5 different genera of early anthropoids, the group that includes the ancestors of every monkey and ape alive today, humans included. They were looking for 2 things: chips, which suggest biting down on something hard, and cavities, which are strongly linked in living primates to a diet of soft, sugar-rich fruit. The results were almost lopsided. Only about 5% of the teeth showed any chipping at all, a strikingly low number compared to primates today that regularly crack nuts or seeds. The cavity patterns, meanwhile, pointed exactly where you'd expect, toward animals eating soft, ripe fruit on a regular basis. Towle summarized it simply: the evidence hints at a preference for soft, sugary food sources. That's not a footnote buried in an old fossil bed. That's a straight line running from an animal that existed 40 to 29 million years ago to the biology sitting in your mouth right now. Sweetness detection isn't something that evolved once in humans for no particular reason. It's carried by a gene called TAS1R2, present across the primate family tree, shaped over millions of years by exactly the kind of dietary pressure the Fayum teeth describe. Animals that could detect and crave sugar-dense food got a reliable, fast source of energy. Animals that couldn't, didn't. Here's what's genuinely counterintuitive. We tend to imagine our ancestors as tough, lean, meat-focused survivors, with sugar as something soft and modern layered on top of that toughness. The fossil evidence says something closer to the reverse. Soft, sugary fruit may have been the foundational diet, the default, energy-efficient choice long before any hominin ever picked up a spear or lit a fire. The taste for sugar isn't a modern indulgence bolted onto a disciplined ancient body. It's one of the oldest instincts that body has. None of this means early primates lived on an endless fruit buffet. Fruiting seasons are unpredictable, and trees compete for the same ripe branches: birds, insects, other primates, all chasing the same narrow window before the sugar content peaks and the fruit falls or rots. An animal with a strong drive toward sweetness had a real edge in that competition, provided it could find the fruit fast enough and often enough to matter. That pressure didn't disappear when our own lineage split off millions of years later. It just changed shape. The early hominins in Africa had access to something even more concentrated than fruit. Honey, and getting it meant confronting one of the more dangerous exchanges in the natural world: a payload of pure, fast-burning sugar guarded by thousands of insects willing to defend it violently. We don't have direct evidence of the first person who ever robbed a wild hive. But we have something remarkable: a painting on a cave wall in eastern Spain, at a site called Cuevas de la Ara, showing a human figure suspended on what looks like a rope ladder, reaching into a crevice where bees have built a nest. It's widely considered the oldest surviving depiction of humans deliberately gathering honey anywhere in the world, with age estimates clustering somewhere between roughly 6 and 10,000 years old. The scene needs no argument to make its point. Someone is climbing toward real danger, at a height where a fall would be serious, surrounded by insects capable of stinging repeatedly. For something sweet, This reframes what eating sugar meant for most of human history. It wasn't a habit. It wasn't a snack. It was a calculated risk, undertaken rarely, for a substance so energy-dense that the danger was considered worth it. Sugar wasn't something you had. It was something you earned at real physical cost, a handful of times a year if you were lucky and skilled. That scarcity is the piece almost entirely missing from how we think about sugar today, and it's the hinge the rest of this story turns on, because at some point, thousands of kilometers from that Spanish cave, people stopped searching for sugar and started growing it. The best current evidence points to the highlands of New Guinea, where a wild grass called Saccharum robustum was domesticated into what we now call sugarcane, likely somewhere around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. A major 2025 genomic study tracing the ancestry of hundreds of modern cane varieties confirmed New Guinea as the crop's true origin point. What's easy to miss is how modest this beginning actually was. Early New Guinean cultivators weren't refining anything sophisticated. They were growing cane to feed pigs and to chew raw, sucking out the sweet juice and spitting out the fiber, much as some communities in the region were still doing well into the 20th century. Sugar at this stage was still fundamentally a plant you consumed by hand, in its own body, unprocessed. The part of the story that would eventually reshape economies, empires, and human health on a global scale hadn't happened yet. That came later, in India, when someone worked out how to boil cane juice down, cool it, and coax it into solid crystals. The exact timing is genuinely contested among historians. Some place it as early as the 5th century BC, others as late as the Gupta period around the 4th century CE, but what isn't contested is what the innovation meant. A liquid that spoiled quickly and traveled poorly had been turned into a solid, storable, tradable commodity. In Sanskrit, this new substance was called sharkara, meaning grit or gravel, the root of the word sugar itself. From India, the knowledge spread outward along trade routes. Sailors carried it towards southern China by around 500 BC. And centuries later, in the 7th century CE, Chinese envoys traveled specifically to India to learn sugar refining methods after the Tang Emperor took a personal interest in the crop. From there, it moved toward Persia and eventually into the Mediterranean world, arriving in Europe as an exotic, expensive rarity, something closer to a spice or a medicine than a food. For a long stretch of history, that's exactly what sugar remained: rare, costly, and mostly reserved for the wealthy or the sick. That scarcity left a strange trace not in written records, but in the teeth of the dead. Across multiple studies, from the Natufian hunter-gatherers of the ancient Levant to Neolithic farming communities in China and Ukraine, researchers have found a consistent pattern. As populations shifted toward intensive grain farming, rates of dental cavities tended to rise, because starchy grains break down into fermentable sugars that feed the same bacteria sugar itself does. But the story isn't as tidy as it's often told. A 2019 reanalysis published in Current Anthropology found that cavity rates between farming and hunter-gatherer populations actually overlapped by more than 70%. Climate turned out to be a meaningful factor too, sometimes rivaling diet in its effect on dental disease. So the popular image of pristine, cavity-free hunter-gatherers giving way to decayed-toothed farmers is real in aggregate, but nowhere near as clean as it's usually presented, which raises an obvious question. If farming alone didn't cause the dramatic decline in oral health we associate with the modern world, what did? The answer comes from an elegant piece of research. In 2013, geneticist Christina Adler led a team examining calcified dental plaque, a mineral called calculus, that can survive on teeth for thousands of years from 34 skeletons spanning roughly 7,500 years of European history. What they were really examining was ancient bacterial DNA, a fossilized snapshot of the bacterial communities that once lived in these people's mouths. The results showed exactly what you'd expect at first: a shift toward a less healthy, disease-associated bacterial community when farming began in the early Neolithic. But then something unexpected appeared. Between that early agricultural shift and roughly 400 years ago, the oral microbiome stayed remarkably stable. It was only during the Industrial Revolution that everything changed again, and changed far more sharply. That's when the cavity-causing bacteria, now considered normal in modern mouths, became dominant for the first time. The Agricultural Revolution, 10,000 years in the making, produced a real but comparatively modest shift in human oral bacteria. The Industrial Revolution, barely 2 centuries old, produced a bigger one. What happened was supply. Sugar stopped being something you climbed a cliff for, or imported at great expense from across an ocean, and became something manufactured on an industrial scale, grown on vast Caribbean plantations using forced and enslaved labor, and shipped to Europe in quantities no earlier century could have imagined. The anthropologist Sidney Mintz documented the scale of that shift with a single jarring statistic. British per capita sugar consumption rose from roughly 4 pounds a year in 1700 to about 18 pounds a year in 1800, a 4-fold increase within a single century, driven by an economic system built on human suffering that few of those consumers ever saw. That's the real rupture in this story. Not the moment some ancient primate first tasted a piece of ripe fruit. Not the moment a person in Bronze Age Spain risked a fall to rob a wild hive. The rupture is barely 200 years old. The moment an ancient, deeply conserved craving, inherited across tens of millions of years of primate evolution, was finally handed an unlimited, cheap, year-round supply of exactly what it had always been asking for. Your body was never built for that supply. It was built for scarcity, for a world where sweetness meant a lucky find of ripe fruit, or a dangerous climb toward a guarded hive, a handful of times a year at most. The craving is ancient. The abundance is not. Almost everything about how sugar affects you now, the cavities, the cravings that feel bottomless, the sense that you can never quite get enough, comes from that mismatch, not from some flaw in your willpower or some modern weakness in your character. Which brings you back to the spoon. Small, ordinary, forgettable, the same spoon you dipped into that bag without thinking 3 minutes ago. It isn't asking anything difficult of you. It doesn't need you to climb a rope ladder or wait for a fruiting season or sail across an ocean. It just needs you to reach for it the way something in your biology has been built to do since long before there were humans to do the reaching. The sweetness dissolving in your cup right now is answering a want that predates your species by tens of millions of years. Only the ease is new.